Right as the billionaire's coffin was being lowered, a homeless man burst into the funeral screaming, "Stop! She's not dead." And what happened next left everyone frozen in fear. Let's continue this story. People thought it was just another quiet funeral in the richest part of the city, the kind where no one cries too loudly and everyone is dressed in dark suits that hide more secrets than sadness. But before the priest could even finish the first prayer, the church doors flew open with a sound so sharp it made everyone turn their heads in shock. A thin, bearded homeless man, his clothes torn and his hands shaking, stood there like a storm had sent him. His eyes were wild, his voice hoarse, but the words he shouted cut through the silence like a knife. "She's not dead." Murmurs erupted instantly. Billionaire Richard Hale's family turned in disbelief. Reporters, who were waiting outside for a scandal or a photo, suddenly rushed in with their cameras ready. In the front row, sitting stiff and pale, was Richard Hale's only daughter, Evelyn. Her face was carefully composed, but the tremor in her fingers gave away that something inside her was breaking. Inside the casket, surrounded by polished wood and white roses, lay Amelia Hart, Richard's most trusted advisor and the woman everyone assumed was dead after that mysterious car accident 3 days ago. Her death had shocked the business world, but nobody had questioned the details. Until now. The homeless man stumbled forward. 2 security guards rushed to block his way, but something in his voice made them hesitate. "I saw her," he cried, pointing at the casket, breathing like he had run for miles. "She's alive. You're burying her alive." Gasps spread like wildfire. Some guests laughed nervously, others frowned in disgust, thinking this was some kind of sick stunt. But the man didn't stop. He clutched the side of a pew to steady himself, his chest rising with desperation. "I was at the river that night," he said. "I saw the crash. I pulled her out with my own hands. She was breathing. She was weak, but breathing. And the men who came after, they took her." Evelyn's eyes widened. She shot a glance at her father, whose face had grown stiff as stone. Richard Hale was a man feared by politicians and worshipped by investors, but in that moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe fear. "Who are you?" someone from the crowd demanded. The homeless man wiped his forehead with shaking fingers. "My name is Samuel. Samuel Cross," he muttered, as if remembering it for the first time in years. "I live under the 7th Street Bridge. I mind my own business, but that night, I heard the crash. I dragged her out of the water. I tried to get help, but before I could, 2 men in black suits took her away. She wasn't dead." One of the guests whispered to another, "This is insane. He's delusional." Another said, "Call the police and remove him." But before anyone could act, Evelyn stood up. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Let him speak," she said. Richard turned to her with a warning look, but she ignored him. The priest stepped back from the casket, unsure of what to do. Samuel's breathing slowed as he looked at Evelyn, as if he recognized something kind in her face. "I tried to follow them," he said softly. "They put her in a black van. I couldn't do anything, but I know what I saw. And 3 days later, I see on the news that she's dead. No mention of the river. No mention of the car. Just a closed coffin and a rushed funeral? Something's wrong." Evelyn's mind raced. She remembered the night of the accident, or what she was told about it. Amelia had been driving home late after a board meeting. The car was found near a cliffside road. Nobody had shown Evelyn the body. They told her it was too damaged, too painful to see. She hadn't questioned it. Or maybe she hadn't wanted to. But now, a stranger's words clawed their way into her doubt. Richard finally stood. His voice was smooth, controlled. "This is nonsense," he said to the guests. "A tragic accident has already taken someone dear to us. This man is clearly unstable. Security, take him out." Samuel flinched, looking around desperately. "Please, open the casket," he shouted. "If I'm wrong, I'll go to prison. I'll disappear. But if I'm right, you're burying an innocent woman alive." The guards moved in, but Evelyn stepped between them and Samuel. For the first time in years, she looked directly at her father with defiance. "If there is even a 1% chance that he's telling the truth," she said, "we have to open it." Richard's jaw tightened. Reporters outside were already filming. Guests were whispering, sensing something bigger than grief was unfolding. Richard glanced at the casket, then at the crowd, calculating the damage. Finally, through clenched teeth, he said, "Fine, open it." 2 men approached the casket. The air felt heavier with every passing second. Samuel stood still, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the lid. Evelyn's heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her fingertips. Nobody made a sound. Even the priest looked pale. The first latch clicked. Someone in the back gasped. Cameras zoomed in. The second latch opened with a dull snap. When the men slowly lifted the lid, a cold draft seemed to crawl through the room. And then, someone screamed. The scream came from a woman near the aisle, her hand flying to her mouth as if the sound escaped before she realized it. Everyone leaned forward, breath held, eyes wide, waiting to see the truth they weren't prepared to face. The men lifting the lid froze halfway, unsure if they should keep going. For a heartbeat, the entire room felt suspended in time. When the casket finally opened fully, a cold silence crashed over the mourners. Amelia Hart lay inside, her skin pale but not sunken, her lips not bruised by death the way one might expect from someone buried after an accident. She didn't look like a body decaying into stillness. She simply looked asleep. Someone whispered, "Where's the embalming?" Another murmured, "Why does she look untouched?" Evelyn stepped forward slowly, her breath trapped in her chest. Her father remained behind her, unmoving, his face unreadable but his fists tightened behind his back. Samuel took one shaky step closer. His voice, barely more than breath, trembled through the air. "Check her pulse." "Please," Richard snapped. "This is absurd. Bodies don't always show." But he didn't finish. Evelyn knelt beside the casket, hands trembling as she reached toward Amelia's wrist. She had never touched a dead body before, and the thought sent a shiver through her bones. But when her fingers rested gently against the skin, her eyes widened. "She's warm," she whispered. The room erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Someone dropped their phone. A man in the back nearly tripped over a pew trying to see. Evelyn pressed her fingers more firmly against the inside of Amelia's wrist, desperation flooding her veins. For a moment, she thought maybe Samuel was wrong. Maybe grief was playing tricks on her, until she felt it. The faintest flutter. A ghost of a heartbeat. But it was there. Evelyn's voice broke. "Call an ambulance," she yelled. "Right now." Chaos ignited like fire. People surged toward the doors. Others backed away in disbelief. Security hesitated, unsure whose orders to follow. Samuel stood frozen, tears filling his eyes, his body shaking with relief no one expected from someone who looked like he had nothing left to lose. Richard moved forward with a calm that seemed forced, his words low but sharp. "Evelyn, step away. You're mistaken. Bodies can retain warmth during preservation." And she turned on him with a fury that silenced him in an instant. "Dad, she has a pulse," she said, her voice echoing off the high church walls. "Don't tell me I don't know what I felt." Samuel finally spoke again, voice cracking. "I told you. I told all of you." He wasn't gloating. He sounded exhausted, as though the strain of carrying this truth for days had nearly broken him. Within minutes, paramedics burst into the church with stretchers and equipment. They pushed through the crowd as guests stepped aside like a dark tide splitting down the middle. One paramedic leaned over the casket, placed 2 fingers on Amelia's throat, and then looked up in shock. "She's alive," he confirmed. Weak pulse, shallow breathing, possible coma state. The air changed. It wasn't a funeral anymore. It was a crime scene tangled in resurrection. Cameras were rolling. People were whispering names that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Richard took a step back, then another, as if gravity had suddenly become heavier where he stood. The priest sank into a pew, crossing himself with trembling fingers. Evelyn clasped Amelia's limp hand as the paramedics prepared to move her. "You're okay," she whispered, though she had no idea if Amelia could hear. "We're getting you out." As they lifted Amelia onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics asked urgently, "Why wasn't she treated at a hospital? Who declared her dead?" No one answered. Eyes turned toward Richard, but he said nothing. His gaze followed the stretcher, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than denial. Samuel tried to follow the paramedics, but a guard blocked him. Evelyn stepped in once more. "He's coming with us," she said firmly. "He saved her. He spoke the truth when none of us did. He stays." The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. Samuel followed, his footsteps uneven, his eyes never leaving Amelia. Outside, flashing lights painted the steps of the church in pulses of red and white. Reporters swarmed like vultures, circling a miracle. Microphones were pushed forward, questions thrown like daggers. Is she alive? Was this a staged funeral? Who is the homeless man? Was this foul play? Evelyn ignored them all as she climbed into the ambulance, still holding Amelia's hand. Samuel remained just outside the doors, unsure if he was allowed inside. She looked at him through the opening and said quietly, "Come in." He climbed into the back and sat on the bench, hands clasped, eyes filled with a kind of haunted relief. One paramedic began checking Amelia's vitals. The other adjusted the oxygen mask on her face. The ambulance doors closed, and the siren pierced the air as it sped away. Evelyn glanced once through the small rear window and saw her father still standing on the church steps, watching like a man whose plans had just unraveled in front of the world. Back inside, the church emptied slowly, guests whispering to one another, reporters calling their stations, and whispers of scandal growing like vines across every mind. Richard finally turned and walked toward the side exit, his assistant trying to keep up. "Sir, what should we tell the press?" the assistant asked. Richard didn't look at him. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. "Tell them nothing," he said, "and find out who opened that casket order. That was supposed to be sealed." But his assistant hesitated before responding. "Sir?" Evelyn requested it herself. Richard stopped walking. For the first time, a flash of something dark and weary crossed his face. Not fear, calculation. Meanwhile, in the ambulance, Evelyn watched Amelia's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. Samuel sat quietly, his rough hands gripping the edge of the bench as though he feared this moment would vanish if he let go. After several minutes, Evelyn finally spoke. "Why did you come today?" she asked softly. Samuel swallowed. "Because when they took her that night, I thought about walking away. I thought it wasn't my business. But I've seen too many people disappear. Too many voices go quiet. I couldn't let them bury her." Evelyn looked at him, a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt in her eyes. "You did more than any of us," she said. "I don't know why this happened, or who wanted it this way. But I promise you, I'm going to find out." Samuel looked at Amelia, then back at Evelyn. "Then be ready," he murmured. "Because the men who tried to bury her, they don't stop just because she's breathing." The ambulance sped through the city, unaware that what had just begun would unravel secrets darker and deeper than anyone in that church had imagined. The hospital lights were too bright, too sterile, nothing like the dim hush of a funeral. The ambulance doors swung open and paramedics rushed Amelia inside, wheeling her through automatic doors that beeped as though announcing something unreal. Evelyn followed closely, her steps fast but measured, determination masking the panic twisting inside her. Samuel trailed a few steps behind, his eyes scanning everything, unsure if anyone would try to pull him away now that the chaos of the church had faded. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Amelia as she was taken into an emergency room. A nurse stopped Evelyn at the doorway. "Ma'am, you need to wait outside," she said. Evelyn wanted to argue, to refuse, but she nodded after a breath and stepped back. Samuel sat in one of the plastic chairs lining the corridor, staring down at his hands, as though trying to remember what it felt like to breathe without fear. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and whispers. Evelyn paced slowly, replaying every moment in her head. Samuel's words, her father's face, the pulse under her fingertips. She didn't know if Amelia could hear her earlier promises, but she meant them. Someone had tried to silence her before the world could listen, and Evelyn wasn't going to let it happen again. After what felt like an hour but was only minutes, a doctor stepped out, removing his gloves. His expression was conflicted. "She's alive," he confirmed. "Severely dehydrated, oxygen levels low, but no internal trauma. No signs of embalming. This woman was never prepared for burial." Evelyn exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Can I see her?" "Only for a moment," the doctor said, then glanced towards Samuel with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "And who is he?" "He's the reason she isn't underground right now," Evelyn said simply. The doctor gave a brief nod and allowed her inside. The room was quiet except for the faint beep of a monitor. Amelia lay motionless, an oxygen mask covering her face, her skin still unnaturally pale, but now illuminated by the possibility of survival. Evelyn moved to her side, hesitating before touching her hand. "You're safe," she whispered. "I don't know what they did to you, or why, but I swear, this isn't over." Samuel stood at the doorway, not daring to come further in. He watched the scene like a man witnessing a world he didn't belong to but had somehow saved. After a minute, Evelyn stepped outside and closed the door gently behind her. She turned to Samuel. "You said 2 men took her. Did you see their faces?" Samuel rubbed his forehead, thinking, "No, it was too dark. But I remember the sound of the van. Old tires, one squeaked when it stopped. And one of the men had something on his wrist. Metal, maybe a bracelet or watch. Shiny, expensive." Before Evelyn could respond, a voice echoed down the hallway. "Evelyn." She froze. Richard Hale strode toward them, his assistant at his side, 2 men in suits following like shadows. The air changed as he approached, tension thickening the silence. His expression was one of controlled anger dressed in public concern. "I came as soon as I could," he said, loud enough for nearby staff to hear. "How is she?" Evelyn faced him, not hiding her suspicion. "Alive, despite being declared dead. Despite being sealed in a coffin less than 3 days after the accident." Richard's jaw flexed. "We were told by medical professionals." "Which ones?" She cut in, her voice sharp. "Who examined her body? Who filed the report?" His eyes darkened. "This isn't the place to discuss that." Samuel watched quietly, shoulders tense. The 2 suited men behind Richard kept glancing at him with disdain, as if he were a stain on the floor. Evelyn stepped closer to her father, lowering her voice but not her anger. "If you knew anything about this, if you let this happen, I will find out." Richard spoke through clenched teeth. "Control yourself. People are watching. News crews are outside. Do not create a scandal that destroys 30 years of reputation," she snapped. "Or lies." For a moment, Richard's mask slipped. His assistant cleared his throat nervously, whispering into his ear. Richard turned away from Evelyn and signaled to his men. "I'll speak to the doctors," he said, privately. Then he walked off without waiting for her response. Evelyn watched him disappear around a corner, that same cold flicker in his eyes she had seen at the church. Something wasn't adding up, and she felt that the accident was not what she'd been told. She turned back to Samuel, who was staring at the floor. "You need protection," she said quietly. "If they know you spoke, they already know," Samuel replied, voice tired. "They saw me in that church. They heard me." "Then you're staying with me," she said without hesitation. He looked at her, surprised. "Miss, I've slept under bridges for 10 years. I don't belong in your world." "You belong where the truth does," she answered. Before anything more could be said, a nurse approached. "Miss Hale, the police are here. They want to speak to you," and she glanced at Samuel, him. Evelyn stiffened. "Tell them we'll talk when Amelia is stable. Not before." The nurse hesitated, then nodded and left. Samuel shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway again. "You shouldn't go against your father," he muttered. "Men like him don't lose." Evelyn's stare hardened. "Then he should be scared, because I'm done losing for him." Down the corridor, Richard stood with 2 doctors behind closed doors, his voice low but firm. His assistant waited outside, his fingers rapidly typing messages into his phone. When the door finally opened, Richard walked out slowly, his expression unreadable, until he caught one of the suited men's eyes and gave the faintest nod, a silent signal only they understood. Back inside Amelia's room, the monitor continued its quiet rhythm, a pulse that should have been silent, a life that someone tried to bury. And outside, under hospital lights, the city already buzzed with the story that would not stay buried either. Night settled over the city like a heavy coat, and the hospital grew quieter, but the air around Amelia's room felt anything but calm. Evelyn sat beside the bed, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor and the soft rise of Amelia's chest. Every few minutes she glanced at the door, half expecting someone to walk in with answers, or intentions far darker. Samuel sat in a chair by the window, his shoulders hunched, hands folded like he was afraid of touching anything that didn't belong to him. He hadn't spoken much since the confrontation with Evelyn's father. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. It felt like the kind that wrapped itself around people who had seen too much in too little time. The police had come earlier, but Evelyn refused to answer anything until she had legal representation present. She wasn't going to let anyone twist the truth before she even understood it herself. The officers said they'd return in the morning. She knew they would, probably with more pressure, more questions, maybe even more accusations. When a nurse entered to adjust the floor, Samuel stood up instinctively to move out of the way. The nurse gave him a polite but uneasy glance, as though trying to understand why a homeless man was in a room with a billionaire's daughter and a woman just brought back from the edge of a coffin. Evelyn said nothing to explain. She didn't know anyone that. As soon as the nurse left, Samuel finally spoke. "There's something else," he muttered, his voice low. Evelyn turned to him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his eyes moving to the door as though checking for shadows. "The men who took her that night, they weren't surprised she was alive. They didn't look shocked to find her breathing. It was like they already knew she wasn't dead." Evelyn straightened in her chair. "You're sure?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I've seen people panic. I've seen people afraid. These men weren't either. They moved like they were following instructions." Evelyn felt a cold rush through her veins. She already suspected this wasn't an accident, but hearing it aloud made the truth sharp enough to cut. "You never called the police?" she asked. Samuel looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "When you've lived out there long enough, you learn who listens and who doesn't. And I've seen things disappear when the wrong people are involved. Bodies, stories, witnesses." She didn't press him further. She could tell he carried 1,000 unspoken memories, and right now, she only needed one truth. He had saved Amelia's life. Twice. Around midnight, exhaustion finally pressed heavy on her, but she refused to close her eyes. Instead, she leaned her head back and stared at the ceiling. "Samuel," she said quietly, "why were you near the river that night?" He shifted in his seat, his voice distant. "There's a spot under the bridge where the wind doesn't cut too deep. I heard the crash. Thought it was thunder until I saw the smoke." His eyes darkened with the memory. "I went because nobody else would." There was no pride in his tone, only a tired honesty that came from a life people chose not to see. Before Evelyn could reply, footsteps approached the room. These weren't the casual steps of nurses or the firm stride of a doctor. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. Samuel noticed too. He sat up, eyes narrowing. The door opened, and one of her father's security men stepped inside. He wore a dark suit, the same type Samuel said he'd seen at the river. His expression was polite, his tone calm, but something in his eyes felt wrong. "Miss Hale," he said smoothly, "your father sent me to escort you home. He doesn't want you staying here overnight. He says the situation is under control." Evelyn didn't move. "The situation is not under control," she said coldly. "And I'm not leaving." The man stepped closer. "There are media outside. Lawyers will contact you tomorrow. Your father insists." "My father lost the right to insist on anything when he tried to bury a breathing woman," she snapped. His jaw tightened just slightly. "You're upset. Understandably. But this isn't safe for you." Samuel stood up from his chair, slow but firm. "She said she's not leaving." The man gave him a cold stare, the kind usually reserved for stray animals or invisible problems. "This doesn't concern you." "No," Samuel said, his voice calm but steady. "But she stays. And so do I." For a long moment, the room was silent except for Amelia's faint breaths. The suited man weighed the situation, his eyes flicking from Evelyn to Samuel to the door. Then he gave a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Very well," he said quietly. "But if anything happens while you're here, remember, this was your choice." He turned and left, closing the door with deliberate softness. Evelyn exhaled, tension leaving her muscles in a slow wave. But she didn't relax. She walked to the door and locked it, then dragged a chair beneath the handle, just in case. Samuel watched her, concern etched across his tired features. "He's not done," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "Neither am I." They sat in silence again, but the quiet this time felt like the pause before a storm breaks. Outside, reporters clustered like flies around hospital gates. Inside, Amelia fought silently for life she wasn't meant to keep. And somewhere in the city, Richard Hale was already rewriting the story that had slipped from his control. Hours passed. At some point, Samuel drifted into a light sleep, though his body remained tense, as if years of danger had taught him never to rest fully. Evelyn stayed awake, her fingers loosely wrapped around Amelia's hand, her mind working through every unanswered question. Why was Amelia targeted? Why was the funeral rushed? And most terrifying of all, why did her father look like he had expected Samuel's interruption before it even happened? The monitor beeped softly, steady but faint. Morning would come soon. And with it, a reckoning no one was ready for. Dawn crept in slowly, brushing pale light across the hospital window. The room was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of feet in the hallway and the consistent beeping of the monitor beside Amelia's bed. Samuel awoke with a sharp inhale, as if pulled from a dream he hadn't meant to enter. Evelyn was still awake, eyes fixed on the door like she'd spent the night guarding it with her thoughts. She didn't speak at first. She just offered him a small nod, one that carried both gratitude and warning. They didn't know what the morning would bring, only that something was coming. At 7:15, there was a knock. Not the slow, ominous tap of the night before. This one was brisk, official. Evelyn stood and approached the door, leaving the chair pressed under the handle until she was sure. She slid it back and opened the door just enough to see who stood outside. 2 police officers. One male, one female. Both in uniform. "Miss Hale," the woman said with calm professionalism. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding Amelia Hart and the events at the church yesterday." Evelyn stepped into the hallway, Samuel rising behind her but staying inside the room. "I told the officers last night that I'd speak with you once she was stable." "She is stable," the male officer said. "And we have questions that need answers before this situation escalates further." Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "Is my father here?" "He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's speaking with hospital administration," the woman replied. And that was all Evelyn needed to hear. She turned slightly. "Samuel, stay with her. Do not open this door for anyone but me." Samuel nodded once. The officers led Evelyn down the hallway to a small consultation room. Richard was already inside, sitting at a table with a slim folder resting in front of him and the same composed expression that always hid more than it revealed. "Evelyn," he said coolly. "Sit." "I'll stand," she replied. The officers exchanged glances. The female officer spoke first. "There are discrepancies in the reports filed the night of the accident. No coroner signed off on Amelia Hart's death. There is no embalming record. No death certificate was officially registered." Richard's jaw worked visibly for a moment before he answered. There was no time for standard procedures. The body was severely damaged. The family requested privacy. "That family," Evelyn said sharply, "was me. And I requested nothing." The male officer cleared his throat. "We're also investigating the possibility of attempted murder." Silence crashed into the room like a stone through glass. Richard finally looked up, his voice soft. "This is absurd. Amelia was like family. You buried her alive," Evelyn said, the words sharp as steel. "Even if you believed she was dead, the speed, the secrecy, none of it makes sense." Richard stood. "You're emotional. You don't understand how business is." "This isn't about business," she snapped. The officers intervened, but tension had already split the air. "We'll need statements," the woman said. "And we'll need to speak to the man who claims to have pulled her from the river." "You mean the man my daughter dragged from the street to create a spectacle?" Richard said smoothly. Evelyn stepped toward him, fire in her voice. "He saved her life. Twice." Before Richard could respond, a nurse burst into the room without knocking, her breath unsteady. "She's awake," she said. Every head turned. Evelyn didn't wait for permission. She left the room and ran. Back in the hospital room, Amelia's eyes were half open, unfocused but alive with flickers of recognition. Samuel stood at her bedside, unsure whether to speak or move, as though touching the moment might break it. Evelyn reached her side carefully, bending close. "Amelia, can you hear me?" Amelia blinked slowly, her gaze shifting from Samuel to Evelyn. Her lips parted beneath the oxygen mask, and a faint, broken whisper escaped. "Don't trust him." Evelyn's chest tightened. She didn't have to ask who. Samuel leaned in slightly. "We won't let them touch you again." Outside the room, footsteps approached. Multiple, heavy, too many to be nurses. Evelyn glanced at the door, then back at Amelia. Amelia's eyes fluttered, panic weakly rising in them. In the hallway, Richard appeared with 2 hospital administrators and a man in a suit Evelyn didn't recognize. The police followed behind them. One of the administrators spoke quickly. "Miss Hale, due to the circumstances and media attention, the patient is being transferred to a private facility for her safety." "No," Evelyn said immediately. "Not without her consent. And not while she's barely conscious." Richard stepped forward. "You don't have the authority to stop this." Samuel's voice cut through the tension like gravel. "She's not cargo to be moved around." She's a witness. Richard's cold stare slid toward him. You will be removed from this building if you interfere again. Evelyn didn't back down. She's not leaving here until she tells the truth, herself. The female officer stepped in. If she's conscious and able to respond, we'll take her statement now. That holds legal ground. Richard opened his mouth to object, but the officer had already moved to Amelia's bedside with a notepad. Amelia's breathing was shallow but present. She looked at the officer, then at Evelyn, then at the door, as if she could see the threat still waiting on the other side. The officer spoke softly. Miss Hart, can you tell us what happened the night of the accident? Amelia swallowed with visible effort. Every word cost her strength she barely had. It wasn't an accident. Richard visibly tensed. The male officer stepped closer. Who hurt you? Amelia's eyes shifted to the door behind them, then back to Evelyn. Her lips trembled, her voice barely more than breath. People he works with. Evelyn didn't need a name. She already knew. Richard stepped forward again, voice tight but calm. She's delusional. She needs rest. Amelia's hand weakly lifted off the bed, reaching shakily for Evelyn's wrist. Evelyn caught it gently. Samuel stepped between Richard and the door without being asked. The officers exchanged a glance. This was no longer just suspicion. The female officer closed her notepad. From this moment, Amelia Hart is under police protection. No transfers. No private interventions. Richard froze. Evelyn stood taller. You tried to bury her once. You won't get a second chance. Samuel looked at Amelia, then at the officers, then quietly positioned himself closer to the window, just in case anyone tried to come through a different way. Outside, cameras surrounded the hospital. Inside, whispers spread faster than truth. And somewhere in the silence between one breath and the next, Amelia closed her eyes again, not in fear, but in the safety of finally being heard. Because the dead don't speak. But the buried? Sometimes they rise louder than the living. If this story shocked you, make sure to hit the like button. For more emotional and thrilling stories like this, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to tap the bell icon, because the next story might be even more unbelievable.